Charlie Kaufman is probably one of the most famous screenwriters working today, and is definitely among the most famous writer-directors known primarily for their writing. Part of Kaufman's renown comes from his incredibly idiosyncratic style of storytelling. He often feels like a writer's writer, or more specifically, a film buff's writer, in that the stories he comes up with are so off-the-wall insane that they're often appreciated primarily for just how odd they are. And yet, the genius of most of his work comes from how the insanity is rooted in a tangible sense of identity and every writer's favorite topic, existentialism. Framing these themes around a notably surreal style of storytelling and character development further planted Kaufman's flag as a screenwriter to watch out for well before he picked up the camera for the first time. But what I want to discuss today isn't the stories originating from his crazed little psyche, but more how he applies that crazed little psyche to the works of other people. Kaufman's relationship with the novel is an interesting one, because while most of his scripts are original compositions, there are a few noted instances in which Kaufman has sought out, or been sought out, to adapt the writings of someone else, and the result has nearly always led to something entirely strange and entirely Kaufman. By diving into each of Charlie Kaufman's book adaptations, hopefully we can get an idea of what the famed absurdist thinks about the works of others when filtered through his insane little membrane. Okay, we're going to keep this first segment short and sweet, because not only is Confessions of a Dangerous Mind Charlie Kaufman's most ordinary book-to-film adaptation, but for all intents and purposes, this isn't really even a Kaufman script. Yeah, his name is the only one credited for the screenplay, but it's pretty well known that when George Clooney took the reins in adapting Chuck Barris's story for the big screen, he also hijacked Kaufman's script and rewrote it into something unrecognizable. The acknowledgement from Clooney himself that Kaufman's original script contained, quote, really funky scenes that would never reach the green light of being a studio film, just goes to show how the tumultuous, studio-backed production of this film, passing through tons of hands before landing in Clooney's lap, wasn't exactly suited to Kaufman's singular style of writing, which always benefited from finding a directing collaborator as singular as Kaufman himself. Clearly, Clooney, in his perfectly acceptable but wholly unremarkable directorial debut, wasn't that collaborator, and the result, according to Kaufman, is a film that the writer, quote, doesn't really relate to, making for an extreme rarity in the filmography of a writer whose off-kilter style is largely dependent on how he personally relates with the material. What we learn from Confessions of a Dangerous Mind is that Charlie Kaufman, evidently, has no place in the larger studio system of adapting books to the big screen. Which is probably something that most of us could have inferred anyway,
Malkovich.
But, it's nice to have confirmation, I guess. In the same year that Confessions of a Dangerous Mind limped into theaters, Charlie Kaufman had a backup film in the pipeline, this time returning to a collaborator who'd already proven to be a perfect match for the writer's peculiarities. Adaptation, a filmic reworking of Susan Orlean's The Orchid Thief, was directed by Spike Jonze. But even with a director as energetic and distinct as Jonze, with a cast that includes Chris Cooper, Meryl Streep, Tilda Swinton, and the ever-enigmatic pair of Nicolas Cage and Nicolas Cage, the real star of Adaptation is, of course, our boy Charlie Kaufman. Most of that is due precisely to how Kaufman chose to adapt Orlean's source material. Famously, when Kaufman was commissioned to turn Orlean's non-fiction book about a group of orchid poachers in Florida into a screenplay, he suffered from enormous writer's block. Now I say famously because even if you've never heard the story of Adaptation's adaptation, if you've seen the film, you know this story. And that's due to the fact that Adaptation's protagonist isn't Susan Orlean, played in this film by Streep, or the orchid poacher John LaHoche, played by Chris Cooper in an Oscar-winning turn. No. The protagonist of this Charlie Kaufman script is, you guessed it,
We open on Charlie Kaufman.
Charlie Kaufman. Told by Sony to adapt this non-fiction crime story into a more palatable narrative like Capote's In Cold Blood, Kaufman instead made the film about his own experiences in having trouble bringing said material to the screen, with the added bonus of fleshing out Charlie's relationship with his twin brother Donald, who's also credited for writing the script and, as it turns out, doesn't actually exist.
We have been hoodwinked, bamboozled, led astray, run amok, and flat out deceived.
So when confronted with the challenge of adapting this particular book to the screen, Kaufman circumvented his roadblock by making the film about himself rather than its intended characters. Adaptation therefore works as a translation of Orlean's story because it becomes about the very act of its own creation, which might seem like a wasted opportunity for anyone hoping for a more conventional film translation of the story they read in The Orchid Thief. But as its own narrative, Adaptation is an incredibly fascinating look into the writing process, both with its own plot and when examined on the very basis of its own existence. So in the end, when faced with the challenge of adapting The Orchid Thief to the big screen, rather than giving up and allowing someone else to take over the material, Kaufman instead used this chance to explore his own psyche and insecurities through the process of describing how he went through making the film. This approach may come off to some as an incredibly self-centered and pompous move on Kaufman's part, but what's undeniable is the fact that this is a book-to-film adaptation unlike any other, fully worthy of its all-encompassing title.
Are you out of your fucking mind?
After Adaptation, Charlie Kaufman decided to take things a bit slower. All he did from that point on was win an Oscar and make the ever-popular transition from mere screenwriter to hallowed writer-director.
No big deal.
After 2 directorial efforts originating entirely from his own thoughts, Kaufman once more turned towards the written word as the inspiration for his next project, honing in on Ian Reid's 2016 novel, I'm Thinking of Ending Things. Now, right from the title, anyone familiar with Kaufman's thematic playhouse can probably deduce why such source material was appealing to him. And when the film came out on Netflix in 2020, the end result was perfectly Kaufman-esque.
Idiot.
Sensational.
Such an oddity with unexpected dance sequences, musical numbers, phantasmic apparitions, Robert Zemeckis low blows, and excerpts from a review of John Cassavetes' most overrated movie? Boy, this Ian Reid guy sure is a nutjob. It's no wonder that someone as oddball as Kaufman wanted to adapt all this material to cinema. Except for the fact that none of the stuff I mentioned is actually in the book.
We have been hoodwinked.
As the book translation, I'm Thinking of Ending Things is, once again, an example of Charlie Kaufman taking someone else's material and drastically changing it for his own amusement. This move angered a lot of Reid's fans, which is totally understandable. Unlike Adaptation, which places Kaufman's deviation from the source material plainly into the text, I'm Thinking of Ending Things is presented as a straightforward book adaptation. Well, straightforward in the sense that there's no apparent meta-commentary, leading any unsuspecting viewer, like myself, to watch this film believing that the entire thing is a reasonably faithful adaptation of what must be a crazy-ass novel. Having now read Ian Reid's source material, I can honestly say that the vitriol leveled towards Kaufman by some of Reid's supporters is warranted, in a way. The film does feel like a bloated rendition of a largely focused novel, twisty and unconventional as its narrative may eventually become. But what's interesting to note is that, for as much left-field craziness as Kaufman adds to the already complex narrative, pretty much everything from Reid's source novel is translated to the movie. Aside from these admittedly important outsider perspective conversations sprinkled between each chapter, you'd be hard-pressed to find any significant detail from the book that isn't added to the screen. The issue people have, it seems, is that Kaufman's additions appear to dilute the psychological terror of the novel, turning what was once a low-key, insulated peek into the psyche of a deeply troubled character into an exercise in bloated art house circle jerking.
Idiot.
Personally, having seen the film twice, I can honestly say that these additions, off-putting as they may be at first, do ultimately serve a purpose. And that jigsaw style of film dissection that comes through in all of Kaufman's best work, while a kick in the ass to some of the novel's fans, does add to the experience. Scenes like the musical finale or the Pauline Kael excerpt do ultimately feel like snapshots of what could have been in the mind of this deeply troubled and regretful soul. Even without watching any informative YouTube analyses of the film, Kaufman's version truly taps into this visceral fear of inadequacy and existential defeat that not only speaks to me personally, but also echoes throughout his other writings. It's pretty clear why, thematically, Kaufman went the route he did, and while some may call it him feeding his own ego, the end result is just as haunting as anything that anyone can claim the source material to be. Having experienced both versions of I'm Thinking of Ending Things, for my money, I'd say that Kaufman's film is my preferred telling of this story. If for no other reason than the fact that A, I didn't have to do any reading, and B, there are exactly 0 Jessies in the book versus the 2 we get in the movie. Mathematically, a win for Kaufman just seems to make sense here. So now that we've examined each instance of Charlie Kaufman adapting someone else's books to film, we can see that the screenwriter has a particularly contentious relationship with the art of relaying someone else's material to his preferred medium. Some, like myself, would be inclined to praise his efforts as subversive works of screenwriting genius. Others, meanwhile, would scoff at his exertions to be different, citing him as a self-absorbed hack who can't be bothered to translate someone else's story unless filtered through his own narrow worldview. Changes are inevitable when putting together any filmic reworking not called Satan Tango. But the extent to which Kaufman adjusts his source material gives many the impression that he barely respects the groundwork that's advancing his career, beyond merely being a stepping stone to revisit some of the themes he's always explored. After all, how would Kaufman like it if he wrote a book that was adapted to the point of near unrecognizability? Actually, Kaufman wound up having a contingency plan for that very scenario. Just 2 months before the release of his I'm Thinking of Ending Things film, Charlie Kaufman made his debut as a writer in the traditional sense, unveiling his first novel, Antkind. The behemoth book follows an incredibly insecure film critic named B, who stumbles across a 3-month-long stop-motion animated film that he feels could be the missing key that ties cinema history together and launches him into the upper echelon of film scholarship. From there, the novel veers into segments about everything from induced hypnosis to Abbott and Costello as scheming murderers to Donald Trump and his identical android lover. From this premise alone, we learn 2 things. 1, Kaufman is, once again, locked in his own head, and 2, this novel sounds like it would be absolute hell on earth for any screenwriter to try and adapt. Having read Antkind, I can personally tell you that the story only gets weirder from its basic premise, to the point where any attempt to adapt this to the big screen would not only be a futile misfire in translating the absurdity of its disjointed narrative, but would also be entirely incoherent to the level of complete pointlessness. And that is exactly Kaufman's goal. That isn't even interpretation on my part, he literally said this. As its own narrative concerns an unfathomable film, Kaufman wrote Antkind with the expressed goal of making the novel as unfilmable as humanly possible. At a certain point, the novel's particular level of absurdity reaches a point of personal exhaustion, but with the express standard in mind, we can see that Charlie Kaufman, in his perpetual need for self-examination, is at least partially aware of his own tendencies to toss away faithfulness when adapting books to film. As a result, Antkind becomes yet another effort in Charlie Kaufman's oeuvre that could have only truly come from his own mind, this time cranked up well beyond any limitations besides his own imagination. With this purposefully unhindered approach, Kaufman ensures that his own brainchild could never be the victim of a screenwriter as ruthless with their adaptive liberties as Kaufman himself. So what do you think of Charlie Kaufman's book-to-film works? Have you seen any of them? Do you prefer his original writings? Sound off in the comments, and stay tuned for the next video, which may or may not have been hinted at somewhere in the second half of this one. Until then, thanks for watching, have a great day, and as always, I'll see you when I see ya.